In part 1 of the BYT suspension upgrade, we did some frame repair and installed a DIY 4x shackle flip on our ORD custom springs. We're also adding new longer travel shocks, so it's time to take a look at shock mounts. Alright, so I've got the spring packs taken apart and put the spacers in, and I started cycling the suspension. And as you can see, I've got the driver's side up, passenger side down, and doing all my measurements at the tires, I'm getting about 13.5 inches of travel, which is a heck of a lot better than I had before. At the spring plates, that works out to about 9 inches of travel. The problem is that where the shocks were mounted in the stock location, I was only seeing about 3 3/4 inches of travel, which means that if I'm using this shock, which is the plan, I'm only using that much of the shock, which is not very good use of my money. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to outboard the shocks and to build whole new mounts, get them a lot more vertical, so I'm getting the maximum amount of dampening I can out of these while not restricting my travel. So this project just got a little bit bigger. Since I've decided I'm going to outboard the shocks, I need to create some new mounts, and I need to mock that up and see exactly where I want the shock to be. I'm using this old Rancho shock because it is not gas charged, so it's easy to place it exactly where I want it and not have to worry about collapsing the shock while I'm just doing the mock-up. The body is about the same length, and it's a little bit wider than the Bilstein shocks I'm going to be using, so it should work great for mock-up, and we'll see how this all turns out. Using the temporary shock mounts that I made earlier, I was able to cycle the suspension and figure out exactly where I want the upper shock mounts to be. And so I started down the path of creating some rather complicated upper shock mounts. When a friend of mine suggested that I mount them the way that newer style Silverados do. Well, turns out I have a newer style Silverado, so I went out, took a couple of pictures, and basically the way they're mounted is on a tube that runs between the frame rails. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of DOM that I've got here, and I'm going to cut 1 3/4 holes in the frame right where I want the upper shock mount to be. I'll run the DOM all the way through and have it sticking out the sides so that I can still outboard the shocks, and I'll have a nice mounting place where I can just use some shock mount tabs and get the shock exactly where I want it in a much less complicated way. I'm getting ready to drill the hole for the cross member / shock mount tube, and got lucky. There is a nice hole here that is almost exactly where I want it to be. So that gives me a good mark on both sides of the frame. You can see the other hole on the other side there, so that I get the hole cut in the exact same spot. You can see here I've marked a spot 7/8 inches from the bottom of this hole, which should be the center point I want for my 1 3/4 hole saw, so that I have a nice point to drill the centering bit in, and I should just catch the bottom edge of this hole. We basically make this a little bit bigger and have a nice spot for our cross member. All right, as you can see behind me here, we have the holes cut in the frame and the tube cut down to 50 inches so far and put in place so I can go ahead and start mocking up the shocks. Honestly, cutting the holes in the frame went way easier than I thought it would be. I thought it was going to take several batteries and a lot of work, and honestly, not a problem. Admittedly, I have lift, so I was able to put the frame at the perfect height so I could just lean into it while standing up. So that may have made it a lot easier than it would be if you're having to kneel down, crawl around on the ground, whatever. But it turned out pretty good. So I'm about ready to throw the wheels back on it and run the suspension through the cycles again with the shock in place, double check exactly where I want it, and we'll see how it turns out. Okay, so after cycling the suspension a bunch more with the new upper shock mount, the plan to use tabs on the top and shock tab on the bottom is kind of out the window. I'm back to making a custom mount. The problem is that on the top, we're just fine because the shock can move forward and back a little bit like this. But because I'm so far out on the axle, it really wants to move like this at the bottom. And that's not really happening with this shock mount. Really needs to be mounted like that so that the shock can move like this without any issue. So I'm going to try to make a custom bracket that will make that happen, and we'll see how she goes. Okay, we've got all the pieces cut that we need to make a perfectly serviceable bracket to mount our shock to the axle tube here and give us the motion that we want here. I'm going to round this off here, probably trim this back a little bit so we don't have to worry about it contacting the shock. And we're also going to ramp this side here so that when we have rocks coming this way, possibly hitting this, it can ramp up over the rock as opposed to taking a direct hit and hitting that. So we'll get the rest of this cleaned up and hopefully get a bracket that isn't too ugly to put on the truck. Alright, we've got the pieces rough cut and a shape that's going to be at least relatively decent looking. And we need to weld it all together and then I'll trim it up just a little bit better. But right now I need to use these to make one more copy for the other side, and then we can weld them all together. And just like that, I now have two sets of pieces I need for the lower shock brackets. So now all I've got to do is weld these together and get them mocked up on the truck, and any sort of final touches I need to make on these we'll make as we get going. All right, brackets are all welded up. I'm not going to win any awards for pretty welds, but you can tell from the bluing, I got plenty of penetration. So these will not be falling apart anytime soon. I'm going to go ahead and plate the bottom of these. Once we get that done, we'll grind these welds down so that they do look pretty, and we'll get her painted up. I had to take a couple of days off, but where I left it was got the rear lower shock mounts all built up, and now it's just a matter of welding them on and making sure everything fits the way I hoped it did. So we'll get back working on this, and I'm hoping to have the shock mounts all welded on by the end of the day. So let's see how far we get. All right, this is the tube that we're going to use for our upper shock mount slash cross member. And I went ahead and pulled it back out so that I can tack these tabs on. It's nice and easy to deal with here on the table. With this being a tube, it's easy to rotate this around, slide it in and out, and I can set this upper shock mounts exactly where I want it, nice and easy. So we'll get this tacked together, get the lower shock mount tacked onto the frame, cycle suspension, get this set exactly where we want it, should be good to go. I've got the cross member welded up and ready to weld into the frame. Right now, I've got this side-to-side set where my previous measurement was. And right now I need to set the height of the top shock. As you can see, this rotates, and so I want to make doubly sure that I get it exactly where I want it. So I've decided that I'm going to set the bump stops from the top of the spring plate here to the bottom of the frame at 9.5 inches. So I'm going to crank this up to 9.5 inches, and I'm going to make sure that from the shock eye down here, the shock eye here, that I have 18.5 inches. That will set exactly my height, because my shock's minimum height is 18, and I want to give myself a little bit of fudge room. I want to give you a better look at exactly why using this tube as an upper cross member and upper shock mount is so handy for mocking up here. As you can see, I can rotate this around pretty much anywhere right now. So it gives me a lot of flexibility on exactly how high I want this shock mount to be. Also, because it's not welded to the frame, I can move it in and out as necessary as well. Okay, I think we have the upper and lower shock mounts where we want them to be. Everything works well, no binding. I think we're ready to burn this baby in. Here you can see that we are welding in fish plates to add some extra strength to our cross member and frame. These are made in the US by Dueling Design. The shock tabs are from Midnight 4x4. Links for both will be in the description. All right, so we successfully outboarded our shocks. We've got the upper mount, the lower mount done. Shocks are bolted up and we've cycled through everything. We've got the maximum travel we can get out of this situation. When we started, we were using some old Rancho shocks mounted in the stock position, and we were only getting about 3 3/4 inches of travel on the shock, effectively doing nothing. So now we've upgraded to these 12-inch travel shocks from Bilstein. They're going to be much better, and because we've outboarded them, we're actually getting a lot more travel out of our shocks. We're getting more use there. So overall, great upgrade, and I'm excited to move on to the next step on this, which will be adding our bump stops.
Hey guys, if you like what you see, subscribe to Uinta Garage, hit the bell to get notifications, like our channel, and share it with all your friends.